His wheelchair faced the floor-to-ceiling windows of the 63rd floor, and Seoul burned below him like a city praying for forgiveness it would never receive. Kang Tae-sung had not moved his legs in 11 months, had not felt anything below the waist in 9, and had not wanted to feel anything at all in longer than his doctors kept records of. Then the door behind him opened, and a woman he had never seen walked in wearing a nurse's uniform 2 sizes too small, her massive hips swaying with the kind of gravity that rewrote physics, and she said 5 words that detonated every wall he had built around the dead thing inside his chest. "Spread them wider for me." She meant his arms. She was talking about a blood pressure cuff, but his hands gripped the armrests of his wheelchair so hard the leather groaned, and for the first time in 11 months, he felt heat, real heat, impossible heat, flooding through a body that every specialist in Seoul had declared permanently cold. Welcome to Black Seoul Romance TV series. Besties, please like, share, and subscribe. She was not gentle about it. That was the first thing he registered. Every nurse, aide, and specialist who had cycled through the Kang estate in the past year had touched him like he was porcelain. Like the paralysis was contagious. Like if they pressed too hard, something would shatter and they would be blamed. This woman planted one thick, beautiful hand flat against his chest and pushed him back against the wheelchair with the casual authority of someone rearranging furniture. Her fingers were warm. Her nails were short and unpainted. Her palm covered the space between his collarbones entirely, and when she leaned in to wrap the cuff around his left bicep, her face came close enough that he could smell cocoa butter and something sharper underneath. Ginger, maybe, or the particular clean heat of someone who had been moving fast before she arrived. Her skin was dark, deep, and luminous, the color of roasted coffee just before it turns black, and it caught the overhead light and held it. Her cheekbones were high and architectural. Her lips were full, slightly parted in concentration. Her lashes were long enough to cast shadows. She was, by any metric he could summon, stunning, and the uniform she wore did absolutely nothing to contain the information her body was communicating. The skirt stopped mid-thigh. It had no choice. Her hips were the kind of wide that fabric surrendered to, curving out from a cinched waist with an authority that the designer had almost certainly not anticipated. Her thighs pressed the seams into quiet distress. The top button of her blouse strained across her chest with the dignified persistence of something that knew it was fighting a losing battle. She was not thin. She was not trying to be. She was big and soft and curved in places that made the room feel smaller, and she moved through space like she had been doing it successfully for a long time and did not require anyone's commentary on the subject. "Spread them wider," she said again, still meaning his arms, because the cuff was not sitting flush. He obeyed. She pumped the bulb. The cuff tightened. He watched her face while she watched the gauge, and something behind his sternum that had been locked in ice for the better part of a year cracked, just slightly, like the first fissure in a frozen lake before the whole surface gives way. "Who are you?" he said. His voice came out lower than he intended, rough from disuse. He did not talk to the medical staff. He had not talked to anyone voluntarily in weeks. She glanced at him, brief, assessing, the look of a woman who catalogued people quickly and accurately. "Shidin Ma Kafour," she said. "Agency sent me. Your previous night nurse quit." She released the cuff, wrote the numbers on a chart she pulled from the bag slung over her shoulder, and said, "Your blood pressure is elevated. When did you last eat a full meal?" He did not answer. He was looking at her hands, at the way she held the pen, firm and efficient, no hesitation. At the way she stood, weight distributed evenly across both feet, planted, solid, like a woman who had decided where she was going to be and was not interested in being moved. He said, "I did not approve a replacement." She looked up from the chart. "You did not have to. Your medical proxy did. Dr. Yoon signed the authorization this morning. I am here 5 nights a week, 8 p.m. to 6 a.m. She paused. "Unless you want to call Dr. Yoon right now and explain to him why you are refusing care again, in which case I will wait." The "again" landed precisely where she aimed it. He heard it. She knew he heard it. She went back to the chart. He looked at her and felt something shift, not dramatically, not like the movies, but like a gear that had been stuck finally catching its teeth and beginning, slowly, painfully, to turn. His name was Kang Tae-sung, and at 60 years old, he was the quietest catastrophe in South Korea's underworld. Not the loudest, not the most violent, the quietest. The Kang Syndicate controlled 4 of Seoul's 7 major port operations, 2 pharmaceutical distribution channels that moved both legal medications and things that were not medications at all, a chain of private hospitals that served as fronts and also, paradoxically, provided excellent cardiac care, and a network of real estate holdings so deeply woven into the city's infrastructure that removing them would have required disassembling entire neighborhoods. He had built all of it across 4 decades with the patience of a man laying bricks in a cathedral he would never see finished. He was feared not because he shouted or threatened or made displays of power. He was feared because when he decided something, it simply happened, and the people who had tried to prevent it from happening were eventually not heard from again in contexts that suggested they had moved or retired, but in tones that implied something less voluntary. 11 months ago, a car bomb meant for his driver had detonated 30 seconds early while he was still in the vehicle. The blast shattered his lower spine. He lost the use of both legs. His doctors, the best in Seoul and 3 flown in from abroad, confirmed the damage was severe and likely permanent. Physical therapy had achieved nothing. Nerve treatments had achieved nothing. He sat in his wheelchair on the 63rd floor of the building he owned and looked at a city he controlled and could not walk through, and something inside him that was not physical but might as well have gone dark. Not just his legs, his appetite, his sleep, his capacity to care about the empire he had spent 4 decades constructing. The men who ran his operations came to him with reports and left with instructions, but the instructions came from habit rather than intention. Muscle memory from a mind that had not fully engaged in months. His enemies knew. The Daeseong Syndicate, led by a man named Hwang Gi-tae, who had been circling the Kang port operations for years like a shark following the scent of something weakening, knew that the old wolf was in his chair and the chair was not temporary. The attempts had begun small, a diverted shipment here, a bribed customs official there, the gentle pressure of an organization testing the fences. They would not stay small. His people knew too. Bang Joon-ho, his chief of security, a man built like a refrigerator and possessed of approximately the same emotional range, had told him directly 3 weeks ago that the situation was deteriorating and that he needed to be seen, needed to appear at the port, needed to remind people that a seated Kang Tae-sung was still more dangerous than a standing anyone else. He had said nothing in response. Joon-ho had left. The silence afterward had been the loudest thing in the building. None of this was what he was thinking about as Cdrama Okafor unpacked her supplies on the medical cart beside his bed. He was thinking about the way she had said spread them wider without flinching, without softening, without the particular vocal adjustment people made when they were talking to someone they considered damaged. He was thinking about the breadth of her hips as she bent to retrieve something from the lower shelf of the cart. The fabric of her skirt stretching across curves that could only be described as architectural, the kind of body that announced itself when it entered a room and did not apologize for the announcement. He was thinking about the fact that when she had placed her hand on his chest, he had felt it, truly felt it, not the phantom half-sensations that occasionally flickered through his nervous system like bad wiring, but real pressure, real warmth, the undeniable confirmation that a living human being was touching him and his body had registered the event. He had not felt that in 11 months. She caught him watching. She did not react the way other women reacted to his attention, which historically had ranged from fear to calculation to a performance of interest designed to get closer to his money. She simply looked back at him with steady dark eyes and said, "I need to check your lower extremities. I am going to touch your legs. Tell me if you feel anything." She pulled the blanket from his lap with professional efficiency and placed both hands on his right thigh. Her fingers were strong. She pressed systematically along the muscle, watching his face. He felt nothing. She moved to the knee. Nothing. The calf. Nothing. She repeated the process on the left side. His face remained expressionless because that was the face he had been wearing for 11 months, and it required no effort. But inside, behind the mask, he was aware of a specific and disturbing irony. The first woman whose touch had made him feel something in almost a year was now touching the parts of him that could not feel anything at all. She finished the examination and made notes. Then she said, "Have you been doing the prescribed exercises?" He looked at her. She held his gaze without looking away. She said, "Dr. Yoon's notes say you stopped physical therapy 8 weeks ago." He said, "Dr. Yoon's notes are comprehensive." She said, "That is not an answer." He said the therapy was not working. She said, "The therapy works when you do it." He said nothing. She pulled a chair from the corner, dragged it to face him directly and sat down. She sat the way she stood, planted and solid, her thick thighs pressing together, her hands on her knees. She said, "I have read your file. All of it. I know what happened to you. I know what your doctors have said. I also know that spinal injuries are not always as permanent as the first 18 months suggest. The nervous system is not a light switch. It is more like a city after a blackout. Power does not come back to every neighborhood at once. Sometimes it comes back to one block, then another, and sometimes it needs help finding its way." She leaned forward slightly. "I am very good at helping it find its way, but I need you to do the work. Can you do the work?" He looked at her for a long time. Her face was open and direct and completely without pity, and pity was the thing he hated most in the world, more than the bomb, more than the chair, more than the Daeseong syndicate circling his empire like vultures. She was not pitying him, she was challenging him, in his own building, in his own bedroom. While his legs lay useless and his empire frayed at its edges and his enemies sharpened their knives in the dark. He said, "You are very direct for someone who has been here less than an hour." She said, "I am direct for someone who has been here any amount of time. It is not a function of the clock." He felt the corner of his mouth move. It surprised him. He could not remember the last time his mouth had done anything other than issue commands or remain closed. She saw it. She did not comment on it. She stood, returned the chair to the corner and said, "I am going to prepare your evening medication and then we will start a basic range of motion routine. You will not enjoy it. That is fine. You do not have to enjoy it. You just have to do it." She walked out. He watched her go. The doorway framed her for a moment, the full sweep of her hips, the confident set of her shoulders, the rust-colored head wrap she wore that should have looked out of place in this steel and glass monument to Korean minimalism, but instead looked like the only thing in the room that was alive. The door closed. He sat in the silence she had left behind and registered that the silence was different now. Not emptier, fuller, as though she had left something in the room that had not been there before. Later that night, she returned with a tray of medication and a resistance band. She administered the pills first, watched him swallow, and checked. Then she knelt in front of his wheelchair and took his right leg in both hands and began the exercises. She was strong. He had not expected that. She moved his leg through its range with firm, steady pressure, bending at the knee, extending, rotating at the hip, and she did it without the tentative gentleness that had made every previous therapist feel like they were handling a corpse. She handled him like he was a body that worked and just needed reminding. Halfway through, she placed both hands flat on his right thigh and pressed, deep tissue pressure, and said, "Tell me if you feel anything at all." Even a whisper, even a shadow of something. He concentrated, he felt nothing. He shook his head. She pressed again, harder, her thumbs digging into the muscle with controlled force, and her face was very close to his leg, close enough that he could see the fine texture of her skin and the way her lower lip pressed between her teeth when she concentrated. She was magnificent up close. The thought arrived without permission and he did not send it away. "Nothing," he said. His voice was rough. She looked up at him from the floor. Her eyes were very dark, very steady. She said, "We will find it. Not tonight, but we will find it." She said it like a fact, not a hope. He believed her. He did not know why. He believed her completely. She finished the routine, covered his legs, and asked if he needed anything else. He said no. She nodded and went to the door. At the threshold she turned. She said, "Good night, Mr. Kang," he said, "T-Sung." She paused. He said, "If you are going to be in my home 5 nights a week putting your hands on my body, you will use my name." She regarded him. Then she said, "Good night, T-Sung." The way she said it, with the slight musical lift of a voice shaped by a different language, a different continent, a different everything. It did something to the dark space inside his chest, something warm, something he was going to have to think about. The next morning he called Dr. Yoon. He said, "The new nurse. Tell me about her." Dr. Yoon, who had known him for 20 years and was one of 3 people in Seoul who could speak to him without formal deference, said, "She is the best I have worked with. Trained in Lagos, specialized in spinal rehabilitation. Moved to Seoul 3 years ago on a medical work visa. Her credentials are flawless. She is also, and I tell you this because it is medically relevant, unusually intuitive with neurological patients. Some practitioners have a clinical understanding of nerve damage. She has something closer to instinct. Why do you ask?" He said no reason. Dr. Yoon was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "She is not the kind of woman you can manage, T-Sung." He hung up without responding. 3 days later she arrived at 8 as scheduled and found the penthouse different. The lights in the main corridor were lower than usual. 2 of the security staff who normally stood at the elevator entrance were absent. She walked through the corridor with her bag over her shoulder and her senses alert. Because she had spent 3 years in Seoul, and some of those years had included neighborhoods where a woman walking alone calibrated her awareness automatically, and this felt like one of those moments. She found him in the study, not the bedroom. He was at his desk in his wheelchair, papers spread before him, and he was not alone. A man stood across from him, mid-40s, expensive suit. The particular aggressive posture of someone who believed his physical height gave him authority over a seated man. She heard the tail end of a sentence as she approached the open door. "Cannot hold the ports if you cannot stand at the dock yourself, old man. The Daeseong group is not going to wait for your legs to wake up." She stopped at the threshold. T-Sung's face was entirely still, the kind of stillness she had learned to recognize as the most dangerous expression he had. The man in the suit turned and saw her. His eyes dropped immediately to her body, traveling over her hips, her thighs, the tight press of her uniform with the entitled assessment of someone who had never been told no in a way that stuck. He smirked. He said something in Korean that she caught enough of to understand, something about T-Sung hiring more interesting staff these days. T-Sung's hand closed into a fist on the desk, not fast, slow, deliberate. The controlled tightening of every finger into a formation that communicated more than any raised voice could. He said one sentence in Korean, quiet and precise, and the man in the suit stopped smirking. His face went through several adjustments in rapid succession, none of them comfortable. He straightened his jacket. He left without looking at her again, walking past her through the doorway as though she had become invisible, which she preferred. She waited until the elevator doors closed at the end of the corridor. Then she walked into the study. She set her bag on the floor. She said, "Who was that?" He said, "No one is important." She said, "People who are not important do not make your hand do that." She pointed at his fist, which was still closed on the desk. He looked at it. He opened it slowly. He said, "His name is Hwang Gi-ti. He runs the Daeseong organization. He has been trying to take my ports for 2 years." She said, "And he came here to your home to threaten you. He said he came here to measure me, to see how weak I am." She said, "And what did he see?" He looked at her. He said he saw a man in a wheelchair. She said, "Then he is not as smart as he thinks he is, because that is not what I see." Something moved across his face, fast and unguarded, there and gone. She unpacked her bag and began preparing for the evening routine, and neither of them spoke about it again, but the air in the room was different afterward, charged with something that had nothing to do with port contracts or syndicate politics. A few days later she was in the kitchen preparing his evening meal. She had started cooking for him by the 2nd week, not because it was in her job description, but because the food his staff left for him was nutritionally adequate and emotionally dead, the kind of food prepared by people who were cooking for a patient rather than a person. She made jollof rice the first night and watched him eat the entire plate with an expression of genuine surprise, and after that she cooked every night, blending her mother's recipes with Korean ingredients she found in his impeccably stocked kitchen. She made a goosey soup with gochugaru, fried plantain with a sesame glaze, pounded yam with a light doenjang broth. She cooked the way her mother had taught her, with love and heat, and the understanding that feeding someone properly was not a minor act. It was a declaration. He had started appearing in the kitchen doorway while she cooked. His wheelchair moved silently on the hardwood, but she always knew when he was there because the air changed, the same way it changed when weather shifted. She did not turn around. She did not need to. She felt him the way you feel a storm approaching, the pressure dropping, the electricity building, the certainty that something was coming. That evening he was there again, silent in the doorway, and she was slicing onions at the counter with her back to him. Her hips swaying slightly to music only she could hear, her skirt doing its usual futile work of containment. She heard his wheelchair move closer, not to the island where he Wusu, ally sat, closer. She turned and found him 2 feet away, looking up at her from the chair with an expression that was stripped of everything except the raw thing he had been trying to contain for weeks. He said Cdrama, just her name. She set the knife down. She wiped her hands on the towel. She looked at him. She saw it. Everything. The want and the fear and the fury at his own body for being broken and the desperate, impossible hope that she might see past the chair and the dead legs and the 60 years and the blood on his hands to something underneath all of it, that was still, against all evidence, alive. She stepped closer. She placed her hand on his jaw. Her thumb rested against his cheekbone. He closed his eyes. She watched a man who controlled ports and politicians and an empire built on silence do something she had never seen him do. He leaned into her touch. He pressed his face into her palm like a man pressing into the first warmth he had felt after a winter that lasted decades. She said his name quietly. He opened his eyes. They were wet. Not falling, not spilling over, just bright with something held back by force of will and nothing else. She said, "I see you." He said, "I know." She said, "Not the chair, not the empire, not what they call you. Yo." He reached up and placed his hand over hers, holding her palm against his face, and they stayed like that in the kitchen with the onions half sliced and the city below them and the entire complicated, impossible distance between who they were closing like a wound that had finally found the air it needed. She pulled away first, not because she wanted to, because she had been trained by life to protect herself from the things that could destroy her. And this man, this feeling, this impossible connection between a 60-year-old paralyzed Korean syndicate boss and a 32-year-old Nigerian nurse with 3 bags of belongings, and a mother's medical bills, and a heart she had been guarding since before she understood what it needed guarding from. This could destroy her completely if she let it. She stepped back. She picked up the knife. She said, "The onions are going to burn." He sat there for a moment, his hands still raised slightly where hers had been, and then he lowered it and wheeled back to his usual position at the island and said, "I do not like burnt onions." She said, "Nobody likes burnt onions, T-Sung." And the way she said his name, with that same musical lift but softer now, quieter, carrying weight it had not carried a minute ago, they both heard it. They both knew what it meant. Neither of them said anything else about it that night. But later, when she was doing his leg exercises and her hands were on his thighs, pressing and stretching and searching for sensation that refused to come, she felt him watching her with an intensity that made the air between them feel thin, like high altitude, like a place where breathing required effort. She looked up. His face was unreadable. His eyes were not. She said, "Anything." He said no, but the word meant something different now. It was not the flat clinical report of a patient describing absence. It was the statement of a man who could feel everything above the waist and nothing below it, and was being touched by the only woman who had made him want to feel again. And the cruelty of that division, the body alive from the chest up and dead from the waist down, was written across his features in a way that made her chest ache. She finished the exercises. She covered his legs. She stood. She said, "Good night, T-Sung." He caught her wrist. Not hard, gentle. His thumb rested on her pulse point, and she knew he could feel it hammering because her heart was doing things her professional composure had absolutely no authority over. He said, "Stay, just for a while." She looked at his hand on her wrist. She sat down. They stayed in his bedroom until 2 in the morning, talking. He told her about his sister, who had died in the bombing that took his legs. Not the same bomb, a different one. 3 years earlier, a retaliation hit meant for him that found her instead. Her name was Kang Soo-yeon. She was 31. She had been a cellist. She had played at the Seoul Arts Center twice, and had once told him that his entire empire was worth less than the silence between two notes played correctly. He said this with the flat precision he applied to everything, but his hand was still on Kdrama's wrist, and his thumb had not stopped moving against her pulse. She told him about her mother, Adiz, who ran a fabric shop in Lagos that had survived 3 economic crashes and 2 landlord disputes through sheer refusal to close. She told him about her father, who had left when she was 7, and about the year she spent caring for her younger brother through typhoid, when she was 19 and still in nursing school, and had no money and no help and no sleep and survived on prayer, and the particular stubbornness of women who have decided that failure is not going to happen on their watch. He listened with his full attention, which was a formidable thing. When she finished, he said, "You are remarkable." She said, "I am tired." He said, "Those are not mutually exclusive." She looked at him. She almost smiled. She removed her wrist gently from his grip and stood and said good night, and walked to the door and did not look back, because if she looked back, she would not leave, and if she did not leave, she would cross a line that she had spent her entire professional life maintaining. She made it to her room. She closed the door. She stood with her back against it and pressed both hands to her face and breathed. Her pulse was still racing. Her skin was still warm where his thumb had been. She said, out loud, in Igbo, her father's language, which she used only when she was talking to herself about things that mattered, "This is not what you came here to do." Then she went to bed and did not sleep until 3, because the ceiling of her room in the Kang estate was very white and very blank, and entirely inadequate as a surface for not thinking about the way his face had looked when he pressed it into her palm. The following morning, she was in the kitchen at 6 making coffee when Bang Junho, the security chief, walked in. He was a large man, solidly built, with a face that communicated nothing and eyes that communicated everything. He poured himself coffee and stood at the counter and said, "Without preamble, the Blasian group attempted to intercept a shipment at Port 4 last night." She set down her mug. He said it was handled. "But it is the 3rd attempt this month, and they are escalating." He looked at her with the directness of a man who had decided to tell her something he was not required to tell her. He said he needs to be visible, at the port, at the meetings. The organization is strong, but an organization without a visible head becomes a target. She said, "He is not ready." Junho said, "That is not a luxury we have." She said, "I will talk to him." Junho looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "He listens to you." She said nothing because the statement did not require a response, and because the weight of it, the implication of it, was something she needed to sit with before she could carry it. That evening she brought the subject up directly. She was taping electrodes to his lower back for a nerve stimulation session, her hands moving with clinical precision while her mind moved with considerably less clinical thoughts. She said, "Junho told me about Port 4. His jaw tightened. She said, "You need to be seen, T-Sung." He said, "I will not be wheeled into a room like a prop." She said, "Then do not be a prop. Be what you are." He said, "What I am is a man who cannot stand." She pressed the electrode firmly against his spine and said, "The most dangerous man in this city has never needed his legs to be dangerous. You built this empire with your mind. Your mind still works. Use it." He turned his head to look at her. She was close, leaning over him, her face inches from his, and the proximity made the air between them do that thing again, that thinning, that altitude shift. She did not move back. He said, "You are doing it again." She said, "Doing what?" He said, "Making me believe things I stopped believing." She said, "I am not making you do anything. I am telling you what is true. The truth does the rest." She placed the last electrode and activated the stimulation unit and stepped back and pretended that her hands were not shaking slightly, which they were, and which she was furious about. 2 days later, he appeared at the port. Junho had arranged the logistics. A modified vehicle, a ramp. The wheelchair was new, sleek black, built by a German manufacturer who made mobility equipment for people who refused to look diminished. She had picked it out. She had not told him she picked it out. Junho knew. She suspected T-Sung also knew but had chosen not to address it. She was not supposed to go. She went. She rode in the follow car with Junho and watched through the tinted windows as Taesung was wheeled to the dock office where 12 men were waiting. Men who ran the daily operations of the port, men who had been hearing rumors for months about the old boss being finished, the empire being soft, the chair being permanent. She watched him enter the room. She could not hear what he said. She did not need to. 15 minutes later, the men filed out, every single one of them walking slightly differently than they had walked in, with the specific posture adjustment of people who had been reminded of something they had been foolish enough to forget. Taesung emerged last. Junho moved to push the chair toward the vehicle. Taesung raised one hand and Junho stopped. Taesung sat at the dock facing the water for a full 3 minutes. The wind off the harbor moved through his hair. She watched from the car and felt something crack inside her that she had been holding together with professionalism and willpower, and the repeated reminder that she was his nurse and nothing more. It cracked because he looked, in that moment, like a king surveying a kingdom he was not yet willing to surrender, and also like a man sitting by the water because he missed the feeling of the wind and had not allowed himself to feel it in months. And the combination of those two things, the power and the vulnerability, existing simultaneously in one man in one wheelchair in one moment, was more than her defenses could withstand. She looked away. She pressed her hands flat on her thighs. She breathed. Junho, sitting beside her, said nothing, but she felt him glance at her once with the brief, unreadable assessment of a man who was professionally obligated to notice everything and personally obligated to comment on nothing. Later that night, back at the estate during the exercise routine, she was working on his left leg when it happened. She pressed her thumb into the muscle of his calf, firm and deep, searching as she always did for any flicker of response, and he said, "Wait." She stopped. She looked at his face. His eyes were wide, not with pain, with something else. He said, "Do that again." She pressed again, same spot, same pressure. He exhaled hard through his nose. He said, "I felt that." She pressed a third time. His hand gripped the armrest. He said very quietly, "I felt that, Kdrama." She maintained her composure for approximately 4 seconds. Then she looked up at him with eyes that were suddenly traitorously bright and said, I told you we would find it." He looked at her from the chair and she looked at him from the floor, and the distance between them collapsed into something that was not physical distance at all, but emotional distance. The last remaining inches of professional separation, and it did not disappear entirely, but it bent, it warped, it became something permeable. And through the gap she could feel everything he was feeling, the shock and the hope and the terror of hoping, and underneath all of it, steady and enormous and aimed entirely at her, a wanting so profound it had apparently survived paralysis and grief, and 4 decades of building walls and the complete conviction that he would never feel anything again. She finished the exercises. She documented the sensation response in his chart, clinical and precise, noting the location and the pressure level and the patient's reported experience. Her handwriting was steady. Her hands were not. She capped the pen. She stood. She said, "This is significant, Taesung. We will increase the frequency of the targeted work on this area. The nervous system is responding. It may spread." He nodded. He was still gripping the armrest. She collected her supplies. She went to the door. "Kdrama." She stopped. She did not turn around. He said, "Thank you." She said, "It is my job." He said, "No, it is not." She stood at the door for a moment that contained more than any door had a right to contain. Then she left. In her room, she sat on the edge of her bed and called her mother. It was early morning in Lagos. Her mother answered on the second ring, alert and warm, the voice of a woman who had spent 30 years answering calls from a daughter who sometimes needed to hear home. Kdrama said, "Mama." Her mother said, "What happened?" Kdrama said, "I think I am in trouble." Her mother was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "The good kind or the bad kind?" Kdrama pressed her fingers to her eyes. She said, "I do not know yet." Her mother said, "Tell me about him." Kdrama said, "How do you know it is him?" Her mother laughed, deep and rich, and full of the specific wisdom of a woman who had raised 3 children alone and kept a fabric shop open through economic collapse. She said, "NWAM, it is always him." "Tell me," Kdrama told her. "Not everything, but enough." Her mother listened. When Cdrama finished, her mother said, "Does he see you? Not your body, not your work. You." Kdrama thought about a man pressing his face into her palm like a man coming home to a place he thought no longer existed. She said yes. Her mother said, "Then be brave. NWAM fear keeps you alive, but it does not keep you warm." She said, "I love you." Kdrama said, "I love you too, Mama." She hung up. She lay back on the bed and stared at the ceiling and said, in Igbo to the empty room, "This is definitely the good kind of trouble." And then she did not sleep. The trouble escalated the following week, but not the kind she had been talking to her mother about. The other kind, the kind that came with weapons. She was returning from the pharmacy where she collected T-Sung's specialized medications, walking the 2 blocks from the dispensary to where Junho's driver was waiting, when she became aware of the car. Dark sedan, tinted windows. It had passed her once and was circling back. She adjusted her route immediately, crossing the street, entering a convenience store, exiting through the side. Moving quickly and without panic, the car appeared again on the parallel street. She memorized the plate. She walked into a restaurant she had never been to, ordered water, and called Junho. She said, calmly and clearly, "I am at the following address. I believe I am being followed. Dark sedan." She gave the plate number. Junho said 4 words in Korean and hung up. A car arrived in 7 minutes. She got in. The dark sedan was gone. At the estate, T-Sung was in the main corridor when she arrived. His face was the version of calm that she had learned to recognize as fury, the flat, precise, absolutely controlled expression of a man who was containing something that would, if released, rearrange the landscape. He said, "Are you hurt?" She said, "No." He said, "Did they approach you?" She said, "No." They followed. I moved. She set her bag down. She looked at him. She said, "This is about the ports." He said, "Yes." She said, "Hwang Gi Ti." He said, "Yes." She said, "What are you going to do?" He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "Whatever I have to do." That night he made calls until 3 in the morning. She heard him through the study door, his voice the low, measured instrument she knew, but with an edge now that was not steel but something sharper, something that cut. She did not listen. She prepared his medication, set it on the table outside the study with a cup of the ginger tea she had started making because he drank it, and went to her room. She did not sleep. She sat in the dark and thought about the sedan and the tinted windows, and the fact that someone had followed her, specifically her, which meant someone knew who she was to him, or had guessed, and was using that information as leverage. She thought about what it meant to be valuable to a man whose enemies measured value in terms of what could be taken away. 2 days later, the jealousy arrived. Dr. Yun came for the monthly assessment, and he brought a colleague, a young neurologist named CEO Minwoo, 32, handsome in the bland, symmetrical way of men who had never experienced real difficulty and therefore had no interesting lines on their faces. He examined T-Sung's legs, reviewed the charts, and when he saw the sensation notes Cdrama had documented, his eyes widened. He asked her detailed questions about her methodology. She answered. He moved closer as she demonstrated the pressure technique on T-Sung's calf, leaning in, his hand brushing hers as he followed her motion on the muscle. He said, "Your instinct for the nerve pathway is extraordinary." He was looking at her face, not the leg, when he said it. His smile was warm, admiring, the smile of a man who had encountered someone brilliant and beautiful simultaneously, and was not bothering to hide that he found the combination compelling. T-Sung's hand closed on the armrest of his wheelchair. The leather creaked. Cdrama glanced at him. His face was perfectly composed. His knuckles were white. Later, after the doctors left, she was preparing dinner when he wheeled into the kitchen and said, "The neurologist." She turned from the stove. She said, "Dr. CO." He said, "His hand touched yours." She looked at him. She said he was following my technique. He said he was not following your technique when he looked at your face and smiled. She set the spoon down. She said, "T-Sung." He said, "I am making an observation." She said, "You are being jealous." The word landed in the kitchen like a dropped glass. He went very still. She said, "He is a doctor examining a patient." Nothing happened. He said, I know what happened and what did not happen. I am not talking about what happened. I am talking about what he wanted to happen. She looked at him. He looked back at her. The kitchen was very quiet. She said, "What do you want to happen?" He did not answer immediately. He wheeled closer. He stopped when he was near enough that her hip was level with his shoulder and his face was turned up to hers, and the height difference, created by the chair and her standing, put them in a configuration that was intimate in a way standing face to face would not have been. His eyes looking up at her eyes looking down at him, the geometry of vulnerability and strength reversed and combined simultaneously. He said, "I want you to know that if any man touches you in any way that you do not want, I will destroy him." Not figuratively, literally, she said, "And if I do want it." His jaw tightened, his eyes darkened. She said, "I am asking a real question, T-Sung." He said, "Then I will destroy myself because watching you want someone else would finish what the bomb started." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she knelt. She knelt on the kitchen floor in front of his wheelchair and put her hands on his knees and looked directly into his face and said, "I do not want anyone else. I have not wanted anyone else since the first night you told me to spread my arms wider for the blood pressure cuff and looked at me like I was the first real thing you had seen in years. I am terrified of this because you are you and I am me, and the distance between those two things is the size of an ocean, but I am more terrified of pretending I do not feel it, because pretending is a kind of dying, and I have already survived too many things to die from cowardice." He placed both hands on her face. His palms cupped her jaw. His thumbs rested on her cheekbones. He looked at her with everything he had, every wall down, every defense abandoned, the full unfiltered weight of a man who had spent 60 years building armor and was now sitting in it shattered, holding the face of the woman who had shattered it. He said, "Kdrama." She said yes. He said, "I am not going to let you go." She said, "I know." He leaned forward and pressed his forehead to hers, and they stayed like that, kneeling and seated, foreheads touching, breathing the same air, in a kitchen on the 63rd floor of a building that housed an empire, while the city below them moved and hummed and knew nothing about what was happening above it. She pulled away first. She always pulled away first. She stood. She said, "The food is going to burn." He said, "I do not care about the food." She said, "I do, because I made it and I do not waste my own effort." She turned back to the stove. He stayed where he was. She felt his eyes on her back, on her hips, on the curve of her waist and the sway of her movement as she stirred, and the feeling of being looked at by him was like standing in direct sunlight, warm and encompassing and slightly dangerous if you stayed too long without protection. They ate dinner. They did not speak about what had happened. They spoke about the port operations and the Daeseong situation and a shipment that was arriving on Thursday that required special handling. They spoke like two people running an organization together, which, she realized with a start that she concealed behind a sip of water, was what they had become. She was not just his nurse anymore. She was not just the woman who cooked his food and exercised his legs and made him believe recovery was possible. She had become something structural, load-bearing, the person he thought through problems with, the person who saw things his lieutenants missed, the person whose presence in a room changed the calculations he made about risk and reward. She had become essential, and essential in the world he lived in meant targeted. She filed this knowledge away. She cleared the plates. She began the evening exercise routine. And when she pressed into the muscle of his calf and he said, "Yes, there, I feel it," she allowed herself exactly 3 seconds of joy before she channeled it into clinical precision and continued working. Because the work was what mattered. The work was what would give him back his body, and giving him back his body was the thing she wanted most in the world, more than safety, more than sense, more than the careful boundaries she had built around her heart, that were now, she acknowledged silently, and with something that felt like surrender, completely and irreversibly gone. The week that followed was the most dangerous of Kdrama Okafor's life, and she did not realize it until it was almost too late. The sensation in his legs was spreading. Every night she worked on him, pressing and stretching and stimulating the dormant nerves with the focused intensity of a woman dismantling a wall brick by brick. And every night he reported new territory. The left calf first, then the right knee, Then, 4 days after the kitchen, a tingling in his right thigh that made him grip the armrest and exhale through his teeth and look at her with eyes that held something she was not prepared to name, because naming it would require acknowledging that the recovery of his body was intertwined with the awakening of his desire. And both of those things were aimed at her with the concentrated force of a man who had been empty for a year and was now filling up so fast he could barely contain it. She documented everything. She called Dr. Yoon and reported the progress in clinical language and listened to the silence on the other end of the line that told her Yoon understood exactly what she was not saying. He said, "This is remarkable." She said, "The nervous system is responding to consistent targeted stimulation." He said, "The nervous system is responding to you, Cdrama." She said nothing. He said, "I am not a fool and neither is he. Be careful." She hung up and stood in the hallway and pressed her back to the wall and closed her eyes and said, carefully and quietly, "I am being careful." She was not being careful. Later that night, she was in his bedroom completing the routine. She had his right leg in her hands, bending the knee through its range, and the sensation work had progressed to the point where he could feel her hands on his thigh, distinctly, fully, not the ghost impressions of before, but real contact, real pressure, real warmth. She pressed her thumbs into the muscle and he made a sound, low and involuntary, that came from a place deeper than physical sensation. She looked up. His head was tilted back against the headrest of the chair. His eyes were closed. His breathing was uneven. His hands were flat on the armrests with the deliberate pressure of a man holding himself in place. She said his name. He opened his eyes and looked down at her kneeling between his legs with her hands on his thigh and her face turned up to his, and the distance between clinical and intimate collapsed entirely, the boundaries dissolving like paper in rain, and she saw in his face everything, the want and the frustration and the grief for the body that could feel her hands but could not yet stand to meet her, and underneath all of it the ferocious, blazing, completely undeniable love of a man who had thought he would never love anything again, and had been proven devastatingly wrong. She stood up slowly. She set his leg down gently. She stood in front of his wheelchair and he looked up at her, this big, beautiful, impossibly strong woman who had walked into his broken life carrying nothing but competence and courage and a jar of shea butter, and had somehow, without strategy or agenda, reassembled something inside him that every specialist in Asia had declared permanently destroyed. He reached for her hand. She gave it. He pulled her gently down, gently, always gently, despite the power in his arms that she knew could be anything but gentle. She bent. He placed his other hand on the back of her neck, warm and sure, and drew her forehead to his. They breathed. The room was very quiet. The city was very far away. He said, "I want to kiss you." She said, "Then kiss me." He tilted his head and pressed his lips to hers, and the world that had been holding its breath for weeks exhaled. It was slow. It was devastating. His mouth moved against hers with the focused, deliberate precision he brought to everything. But underneath the precision was something raw and trembling, a man rediscovering a language he thought he had forgotten. His hand tightened on the back of her neck. Her hands found his shoulders, broad and solid, the one part of his body that had never failed him, and she held on. He deepened the kiss and she felt it everywhere, in her stomach, in her chest, in the places where she had stored loneliness for so long it had calcified into something she mistook for independence. His other hand found her waist, her hip, the generous curve of her body that she had spent years learning not to apologize for, and he pulled her closer, into the space above the wheelchair, into him, as close as the chair would allow, and she could feel the tension in his arms. The strain of wanting to stand, wanting to rise to her, wanting to meet her at full height, and the impossibility of it cracked something open in both of them that made the kiss taste like salt. She pulled away. Her forehead stayed against his. Her breathing was ragged. He was worse. She said, "T-Sung." He said, "Do not say my name like that unless you are prepared for what comes after." She said, "What comes after?" He said, "Everything. I will give you everything. Everything I have and everything I am and everything I have built and destroyed and rebuilt. All of it." She looked at him through eyes that were wet in a way she was going to blame on the emotional intensity of the neurological progress and nothing else. She said, "I do not want everything. I want you." He closed his eyes. His hand was still on her hip, still holding her at the border of his wheelchair like a man holding the edge of a cliff he was both terrified and desperate to fall from. He said, "You have me. You have had me since the blood pressure cuff." She almost laughed. Almost. The sound was closer to a sob. She pressed her lips to his forehead and straightened and said, "I need to finish the chart notes." He said, "The chart notes can wait." She said, "The chart notes cannot wait, because if I do not write them now, I will not write accurate numbers because my hands are shaking and a doctor might actually need these records." He looked at her hands. They were shaking. He took one of them and held it until it was still. Then he let her go. She wrote the chart notes at the kitchen counter with a cup of cold tea and hands that had stopped shaking but had not forgotten the feeling of his shoulders under her palms. She wrote the numbers and the observations, and then she closed the chart and put her head down on her folded arms on the counter and breathed for a full minute. Then she lifted her head and went to her room and closed the door and sat on the bed and touched her own lips and said, in Igbo, "To no one, I am ruined." She meant it as a complaint. It came out like gratitude. The next morning she woke to commotion, not the organized, efficient movement of the estate's daily operations. Something sharper. She dressed quickly and came into the main corridor to find Junho and 3 other security personnel in tactical conversation. Junho saw her and said, "Come with me." He took her to the study. T-Sung was at his desk, phone in hand, face carved from stone. He looked at her when she entered and something moved behind his eyes that was not stone at all, something soft and scared and furious. He said, "Hwang Gi-T has taken port 4. Not attempted. Taken. During the night, a coordinated operation had overwhelmed the Kang security team at the port, disabled the surveillance systems and physically occupied the dock facilities. 7 of T-Sung's men were injured. 2 were missing. The port was now under Dseong control and Hwang Gi-T had sent a message, delivered through a channel that implied diplomatic courtesy, while communicating naked aggression, suggesting that the remaining ports could be discussed like civilized men at a meeting of his choosing on his terms. T-Sung's hand was on the desk. It was not a fist. It was flat, fingers spread, pressing down with the kind of force that suggested if the desk were not solid oak, it would have broken. He said, "To Junho, the status of our people," Junho reported. T-Sung listened. Then he said, a series of instructions in Korean that she followed well enough to understand the shape of mobilization orders, redeployment of security assets, communication blackouts, the machinery of a man going to war. Junho left. The study was empty except for the 2 of them. She said, "What do you need from me?" He looked at her. He said, "I need you to be safe." She said, "Tell me what to do and I will do it." He said, "I am telling you what to do. Be safe. Stay here. Do not leave the building." She said, "I am not going to sit in my room while your world is on fire." He said, "You are going to do exactly that because you are the only part of my world I cannot rebuild if it burns." She stared at him. He stared back. Neither of them blinked. Then she said, "Fine, but I am going to be useful from here. Tell me what is in the files and I will help you think through it." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he opened the bottom drawer of his desk and pulled out 3 folders and said, "Read these. Tell me what you see." She sat down. She read. She told him. The next 48 hours were a masterclass in controlled escalation. She watched from inside the estate as T-Sung conducted a war from his wheelchair with the precision of a man who had been doing this for 4 decades and did not require legs to do it effectively. He made calls. He received people, men she had not seen before, some in suits, some not, all of them carrying the particular energy of competence under pressure. He gave orders that were brief and specific and were not questioned. She moved through the estate keeping his body functioning, forcing food into him at intervals, administering medication he tried to skip, doing the exercises he said he did not have time for and she said were not optional. She brought tea. She brought files. She stood beside his wheelchair during 2 meetings and said nothing but watched everything. And afterward she told him what she had observed, and twice her observations changed the direction of his next decision. On the second night, at 3 in the morning, She found him in the study with the lights off, facing the window. The city was below. The wheelchair was very still. She stood in the doorway and said, "T-Sung." He did not turn. He said they found the two missing men. She waited. He said, "They are alive. Injured. In a hospital in Incheon." She exhaled. He turned the chair to face her. In the dark, his face was all shadows and hard angles, and the wet glint of eyes that held something he was not going to say in full light. He said, "He has sent a message that specifically references you." She felt the floor shift under her feet. Not literally, but the way the ground shifts when you realize the danger you thought was behind you is actually underneath you. She said, "What does the message say?" He said, "It says he knows who you are. It says you are valuable to me. It says valuable things should be stored more carefully." She stood in the doorway and processed this. She processed it the way she processed everything, quickly and efficiently, categorizing threat levels, assessing options, building a response framework. But underneath the processing, underneath the clinical efficiency, she was afraid. Not the kind of fear that freezes, the kind that sharpens. The kind she had carried in different forms since she was 19 and alone in a hospital with a dying brother and no money. The fear that does not paralyze but clarifies. She said, "What are you going to do?" He said, "I am going to end this." She said, "How?" He said, "I am going to give him what he wants." She felt cold. She said, "The ports." He said, "A meeting. On neutral ground, face to face. He wants to see me in the chair. He wants to confirm what he believes, that I am finished." She said, "And you are going to let him see." He said, "I am going to let him see exactly what I want him to see." She looked at him in the dark. She said, "What is that?" He said, "A man with nothing left to lose. Because a man with nothing to lose is the most dangerous thing in the world, and Hwang Gi has made a critical error. He thinks taking my port and threatening the woman I love has weakened me. It has not weakened me. It has freed me." She heard the word love in the middle of that sentence. The way you hear a gunshot in a quiet room. Everything before and after it becomes irrelevant. Just the word, just the detonation of it. He said it without emphasis, without pause, embedded in strategic analysis, as though it were simply another fact, which to him it was. She stood in the doorway and let the words settle into her body, and felt it take root in places she had been protecting for 32 years. She crossed the room. She knelt beside his wheelchair. She took his hand and pressed it to her chest, over her heart, and said, "Come back to me." He said, "I have not left." She said, "I mean from whatever you are about to do. Come back." He turned his hand in hers and laced their fingers together and held them against her heartbeat and said, "I will always come back to you. Every time. From everything." She stayed with him until the sun came up. They did not kiss. They did not need to. They sat together in the dark study with their hands intertwined, and the city waking below them, and the full weight of what was coming pressing down like weather. And they breathed together, in and out. The simple, persistent act of two people choosing to exist in the same space and refusing to be separated by anything. Not distance, not danger, not the chair, not the ocean between their origins, not the 60 years and 32 years, and the entirely different lives that had somehow, impossibly converged in a penthouse in Seoul where a broken man had been told to spread his arms wider by a woman who would end up spreading open every sealed chamber of his heart. The meeting happened 3 days later. She was not there. He would not allow it. She stayed at the estate with a security detail and a phone that she held without unlocking for 4 hours straight, her thumb resting on the screen, her heart doing things that no clinical training could regulate. Junho called once at the 2-hour mark and said, "Proceeding." That was all. She sat on the kitchen stool and did not make tea, and did not eat, and did not move. She sat and waited and learned a new kind of fear. The fear of loving someone who walks willingly into danger because they have decided that protecting what they love is worth more than protecting themselves. He came back at 9 in the evening. The elevator doors opened and he wheeled out, and she saw his face and knew immediately that something had shifted, not just tactically but fundamentally. He looked at her standing in the corridor, waiting, her hands at her sides, her eyes bright with the tears she had not allowed herself to cry during the 4 hours of silence, and he said, "It is done." She said, "What happened?" He said, "Giti miscalculated. He expected a man begging for terms. He received something else. She said, "What did he receive?" Taesung said, "A man who looked him in the eye from a wheelchair and told him that the last person who threatened someone I loved is buried in a place I will take you to if you do not return to my port by midnight." She said, "Is that true?" He said the port was returned by 11:47. She exhaled. Her whole body softened. She crossed the corridor and put her arms around him from behind, her chin on the top of his head, her body curving around the wheelchair, wrapping him in the full, generous, encompassing warmth of her. And he reached up and placed both hands on her forearms and held on, and they stayed like that, while the security team moved through the penthouse around them, professional and discreet. And no one looked at them directly, but everyone saw, and everyone understood. That night she did not go to her room. She did not plan it. She did not decide. She finished the exercises, documented the continued expansion of sensation. His right thigh now responded to light touch. His left knee was showing reflexive movement. The recovery was accelerating in ways that Dr. Yoon called unprecedented, and she called inevitable because she had decided it would happen, and she did not make decisions she was unwilling to enforce. And when she finished and stood and started toward the door, he said, "Kdrama, stay. Not for a while. Stay." She turned. She looked at him in the wheelchair, this man, this impossible, infuriating, beautiful, broken, rebuilt, ferocious, gentle man, who had been a stranger 3 months ago and was now the center of a gravity she could not escape and did not want to. She walked back to him. She knelt. She took his face in both hands, her palms against his jaw, her thumbs on his cheekbones, the mirror of the first time he had touched her face in this same kitchen weeks ago, and she kissed him. She kissed him with everything she had been holding back, the professionalism and the fear and the distance and the careful boundaries. She kissed her back with the desperate, consuming intensity of a man who had been drowning and had finally reached air. Consuming intensity of a man who had been drowning and had finally reached air. She guided the wheelchair to the bedroom. She closed the door. The city lights came through the windows and painted everything in silver and shadow. She looked at him, and he looked at her, and she said, "Are you sure?" He said, "I have never been more sure of anything." She moved close. She touched his face. He reached for her waist, pulling her into his lap, into the wheelchair, her knees on either side of his hips, her full weight settling against him. And he made a sound against her mouth that was half relief and half reverence, and the rest of what happened was between them, slow and tender and fierce and quiet, a conversation conducted entirely in breath and touch, and the small sounds that people make when walls finally come down. And the city turned outside, and the night deepened, and no one interrupted, and nothing was broken that was not already breaking, and everything that needed to be given was given freely and without reservation. She woke before dawn. She was in his bed. He was beside her, asleep, his face younger in sleep than it was awake, the lines softened, the vigilance released. His arm was across her waist, heavy and warm. She lay still and looked at the ceiling and felt the full weight of what had happened settle into her body, not with regret, but with the terrifying clarity of a woman who has crossed a line she cannot cross and must now live in the country on the other side of it. Fear arrived then, on schedule, as it always did. She thought about what she was, a Nigerian nurse on a work visa in a country that was not hers, in the bed of a man whose name was spoken in whispers, whose enemies had already identified her as a pressure point, whose world operated by rules she was still learning. She thought about the distance between them, not the physical distance that they had eliminated hours ago, but the structural distance, the gulf of power and culture and age and history that did not disappear because two people wanted each other in the dark. She thought about what would happen when the dawn came and the world reasserted itself, and he remembered what he was, and she remembered what she was, and the distance became visible again. She moved his arm carefully. She got up. She dressed in the silver light. She picked up her shoes. She moved to the door. His voice came from the bed, low and clear and fully awake. "Where are you going?" She stopped. She did not turn around. She said, "To my room." He said, "Why?" She said, "Because when you wake up properly, you are going to remember who you are and what I am, and the mathematics of this will not work in the daylight the way it worked in the dark." He was quiet for a moment. Then she heard the bed shift, the sound of his arms working, the wheelchair, the transfer, the wheels on the floor. He came up behind her. His hand found hers. He said, "Turn around." She turned. He looked up at her from the chair. His face was not the face of a man doing mathematics. It was the face of a man who had found something he was never going to calculate his way out of, and did not want to. He said, "I am 60 years old. I am in a wheelchair. I run an organization that operates in spaces the law does not fully reach. I have enemies who will use you to hurt me. None of this is new information. I knew all of it before last night. I know all of it now. And I am telling you in the first light of the first morning of the rest of my life that none of it changes what is true." He pulled her hand to his chest. He held it there, over his heart. He said, "I love you. Not in the dark, in the daylight, in front of mathematics. I love you, and I am not going to let you leave this room believing anything else." She looked at him, her eyes filled. She said, "I am afraid." He said, "I know. So am I." She said, "You are not afraid of anything." He said, "I am afraid of this room without you in it. That is the only fear I have left." She knelt in front of the wheelchair. She put her arms around him. She pressed her face into his neck and held on, and he held her back, his arms around her full, warm body, pulling her into him, the chair, the man, the everything. And they held each other in the early light while the city woke up below them, and the fear did not leave but became smaller, became manageable, became something they could carry together instead of something that carried them apart. She stayed. The days that followed were different, not easy. The Daeseong threat had been neutralized but not eliminated. Hwang Gi-tae had returned to the port but had not disappeared, and men like him did not absorb humiliation without planning a response. Security remained heightened. Junho assigned a permanent detail to Cdrama that she tolerated with the graceful impatience of a woman who understood the necessity but did not enjoy being followed to the grocery store. The estate staff adjusted to her presence in Taesung's quarters with the professional neutrality of people who had been employed long enough to know that their opinions about their employer's personal life were neither requested nor relevant. But inside the estate, inside the private hours between 8 in the evening and 6 in the morning, something extraordinary was happening. His recovery accelerated. The sensation spread from his calves and thighs into his hips, then his lower back. She worked on him every night, her hands mapping the returning geography of his body with a combination of clinical expertise and a tenderness that she no longer tried to separate from her professional technique, because the separation had become impossible and the results spoke for themselves. 3 weeks after the night in the bedroom, during a routine exercise, she pressed his foot against her palm and said, "Push." He pushed. His foot moved. Not much. A tremor of flex. The barest contraction of muscles that had been dormant for almost a year. But it moved. She looked at him. He looked at her. She said, "Again." He pushed again. Stronger. She started crying. She did not try to stop. He pulled her close with both hands and held her while she cried into his shoulder, and he was crying too, silently, the way he did everything, without noise, without display. Just the wet evidence on his face of a man who had been given back something he thought was gone forever. Dr. Yoon was called. He examined the progress and said very little, which for a man who was never at a loss for words was the highest form of astonishment. He ran tests. He consulted colleagues. He said, "This should not be possible at this stage," she said. And yet, he looked at her. He said, "What have you done?" She said, "My job." He said, "Your job does not typically include miracles," she said. "It does when I am the one doing it." By the 6th week of their relationship, Taesung could stand, not walk, stand. With support, with effort, with the concentrated determination of a man who had decided that he was going to rise to his full height and look the woman he loved in the eye at her level for the first time, and he did. She was in the kitchen making lunch when she heard the sound behind her, not the wheelchair. Something different, footsteps. Uneven and labored but unmistakably footsteps, and she turned and he was there, standing braced against the counter, his face white with effort, his legs trembling under him but standing up. She dropped the spoon, she covered her mouth. He said, breathing hard, "Come here." She went. She stood in front of him and he was taller than her. She had known this from the proportions, but knowing it, and experiencing it were different things entirely. And she had to look up for the first time, and he looked down at her with the face of a man who had climbed out of a grave to find the sun still shining. And he put his arms around her and held her upright because his arms were strong even when his legs were not. And they stood together in the kitchen, vertical, face to face, heart to heart. And she said, "I knew it. I knew you would." He said, "You knew it before I did." He sat down after 90 seconds because his legs could not yet sustain the weight, but the 90 seconds were enough. They were everything. He sat in the wheelchair and looked at her and said, with the quiet certainty of a man who had made a decision he would enforce with everything he had, "Marry me." She stared at him. She said, "What?" He said, "I am not repeating it because you heard it, and we both know you heard it." She said, "T-Sung, we have known each other for 3 months." He said, "You are proposing to me in the kitchen while I am holding a wooden spoon." He said, "You are proposing to me in the kitchen while I am holding a wooden spoon." He said, "I am proposing to you in every room. The kitchen is just where we happen to be." She put the spoon down. She knelt in front of his chair again, this position that had become their geometry. And she said yes. She said it simply and clearly and without drama, because the drama was in the word itself, in the weight of it, in the impossible distance it had traveled from a rented room in Mapo-gu to a penthouse on the 63rd floor, from a cleaning visa to a lifetime, from a woman who had come to Seoul to survive to a woman who was choosing to stay because she had found something worth more than survival. He kissed her. She tasted salt. She did not know if it was his tears or hers. She did not care. The wedding was small, held in the estate, exactly 6 months after the night she had first walked through the penthouse doors with a blood pressure cuff and a refusal to treat him like he was fragile. Jun-ho stood as witness. Dr. Yun attended, wearing an expression of a man who had been proven wrong about several things and was delighted about all of them. Woo Seoyeon, the technology specialist who had been moved from a previous assignment to T-Sung's core team, managed the communications blackout that ensured no photographs left the building because a man like Kang T-Sung did not marry without his enemies finding a way to weaponize the event. Her mother attended via video call, watching from the fabric shop in Lagos on a screen propped between rolls of Ankara and a sook, crying and laughing and saying, "NWAM, NWAM," and her voice filled the room in a way that made even Junho look away for a moment. Kdrama wore white, not a traditional gown, something simpler, a fitted dress that her mother's tailor in Lagos had made and shipped, and that fit her body the way everything she wore fit her body, tightly, generously, without apology. Her hips and her curves and her full, magnificent self presented as exactly what they were, which was everything. T-Sung wore a dark suit and stood for the ceremony, stood for the full 45 minutes, his legs trembling but holding, his hand gripping hers for stability. And when the officiant said the words, and they said the words back, he looked at her with the face of a man who had rebuilt an empire and a body and a heart, and was now rebuilding a life with her around her, because of her. 4 months later, she was in the kitchen making a goosey soup when the nausea hit. She set down the spoon and gripped the counter and breathed. It passed. It came back. She stood very still and counted days in her head and felt something bloom inside her chest that was not nausea at all, but the beginning of something else entirely. She found the test in the bathroom cabinet. She looked at the result. She walked to the study. He was at his desk, standing now. He stood for most of the day, walking with a cane that he used with the same precise, efficient authority he applied to everything. He saw her face. He set down his pen. He said, "What is it?" She walked to him. She took his hand. She placed it flat on her stomach. She said nothing. She did not need to. His hand pressed gently against her belly, and his eyes moved from her stomach to her face, and she watched realization arrive in them like sunrise, slow and then all at once. And his face, the face that commanded an empire and had looked down the barrel of Hakwang Giti's ambition without flinching, that face broke open into something she had never seen on it before, something unguarded and radiant and terrified and joyful in equal measure. And he said, pulling her close, pulling her into him, his face in her neck, his voice cracked and rough and full, "Chdinma, Chdinma," said he, held his head against her and felt his tears on her skin and said, "I know, I know." Seoul moved below them, 63 floors of air between their life and the soup burned on the stove, and neither of them moved to save it. because some things are worth more than what is cooking, and some loves are built not from convenience or logic or the careful calculation of compatible lives, but from the raw, stubborn, miraculous collision of two people who had no business finding each other and found each other anyway, in a corridor at 2 in the morning, over a blood pressure cuff, with 5 words that changed everything, spread them wider for me. And he did. He spread everything wider, his arms, his world, his empire, his heart. For her, only for her, always for her.